Hey everyone, I'm Will, and this is another episode of RetroTechBytes. So, welcome back, and to those of you who are new, welcome. Good to have you. Anyway, let's get chatting about today's topic. First of all, hope your June's going great, and happy GPU June, everybody. So, today I wanted to talk about a interesting proposition from the late 90s. So, it's 1998, you want a fast GPU. You're thinking, okay, got a few options. I don't want to spend a lot of money, so Voodoo 2 is out. Should I go for the original Voodoo? You know, the original Voodoo, cool card, right? You know, everyone knows 3DFX. It's got 4 megs of RAM, fast as can be. It's like totally awesome. There's nothing that rivals it, right? Not so fast. Let's talk about the alternative. Let's talk about the one that nobody really cares about anymore, at least. Let's talk about the cool one. The ATI Rage. Yep, it's one of these videos. Alright, so you're probably thinking, why are we even talking about the ATI Rage? Like, there's nothing cool about this. But that's where you're totally wrong. There are a lot of really cool things about this. First, when you think 3D Accelerator proprietary API, your mind probably tells you, okay, Glide was 3DFX's proprietary API, so we're talking about a 3DFX card. Not so fast. This card could run ATI's proprietary API, CIF. There's not a lot out there about CIF, and there's not a lot of games, but we'll get to that. The ATI 3D Rage Pro, or 3D Rage Pro Turbo in this case, is an awesome card. Like, just speaking from the heart here. It's absolutely fantastic, a joy to use, and very fast. I mean, it is almost as fast as a Riva 128. It is faster than the Voodoo 1. It's clocked higher at 75 megahertz. It has 8 megabytes of SG RAM, at least with the RAM expansion on here, and it's overall an excellent card. In CIF, though, it provides 3D acceleration through the CIF API that I would say is probably comparable to Glide in terms of performance. Now, early iterations of this card were not great. I mean, the ATI 3D Rage 1 was slow as a dog and not fast. But by the time the Rage Pro Turbo or the 3D Rage Pro 2X, the AGP variant here came around, this card was dominating the market in terms of being just cheap and fast. But it wasn't dominating the right market. This card ended up in a lot of corporate hands, not a lot of consumer hands. And you'll see what I mean. But anyway, let's talk about it. Why did it fail? Why did what is seemingly an awesome card that rivals, you know, the 3DFX Voodoo 1 of all things, just absolutely go out of vogue? And why doesn't anyone use it anymore? Why does everyone recommend against it even? Let's talk about it. Let's explore it, and let's have some fun with ATI CIF. So, in a little while, you'll see a showcase of CIF. But for now, let's get some history to ATI, the Rage line, and what led to the Rage Pro Turbo. Our story begins in 1996 with the release of the ATI 3D Expression, also known as the ATI 3D Rage 1. The ATI 3D Rage 1 was supposed to mark ATI's venture into the 3D accelerator market. Its main competition then was the 3DFX Voodoo 1 and the NVIDIA NV1. Unfortunately for NVIDIA, the NV1 had been pretty much a flop when it came to consumer sales. Now, as far as the 3DFX Voodoo 1, well, that was a different story, and by the many videos populating GPU June about its legendary status, as well as the many videos that my friends have put out regarding, you know, just how awesome a card it is, you can see why it was so impactful. But yeah, the competition was stiff. But ATI had a secret weapon, also known as ATI CIF. CIF was ATI's proprietary programming interface, and it was supposed to take on the 3DFX Glide interface. But here's where things get a little screwy in the history of ATI CIF. ATI never actually really marketed CIF beyond, well, one obscure line on the 3D Expression's website. In fact, Microsoft Direct 3D and OpenGL are listed before ATI 3D CIF. Sure, ATI CIF was marketed, but the card itself was marketed as a 3D accelerator that could do other things before ATI even marketed their own API. Even this chart from the ATI webpage, which, well, I apologize for its extremely low resolution, just confirms that. At the very bottom of the stack is ATI CIF, and it only has one checkmark under Windows 95. Unlike 3DFX, which, well, became synonymous with its API Glide, ATI and CIF didn't really go anywhere as a pair. Unfortunately for ATI, or perhaps by its own volition, ATI CIF was doomed to fail from the very beginning. Or was it? Popular Mechanics here actually talked about the arrival of the PC and noted the various 3D accelerated titles including Mechwarrior 2 and VR Soccer, which were created specifically for ATI. Now, they didn't mention the words ATI CIF, but I can say with certainty that that is the API for which these ran. The ATI CIF API did in fact support both Mechwarrior 2 3D Rage Edition and VR Soccer. Actually, I'll be showing you Mechwarrior 2 later. But ATI realized that it needed to gain a foothold in the market of gamers. So, what did it do? It changed its branding from Expression to Expert for some of these cards. And the ATI Expert line was launched. Again, derivatives of the 3D Rage line, the ATI Expert cards offered excellent 2D performance and fantastic 3D performance. That being said, as you can see by the advertisement, this was somewhat confusing though, because the cards were offered in a way that was, well, 2D centric, not 3D centric. Early iterations of ATI CIF and the 3D Rage cards were met with, well, mixed reviews. This review from CNET actually talks about how the card offers good 3D acceleration, but at higher resolutions like 640 by 480 with a Pentium 120, the card falls flat. Unlike the 3DFX Voodoo, which via Glide was able to provide superb acceleration even on slower CPUs, the ATI CIF API was not as streamlined and not as processor friendly. And from Vintage3D, we have an excellent write-up about ATI's Rage architecture and ATI CIF. ATI, as Vintage3D puts it, was not pushing proprietary CIF environment and fully embraced open APIs. So what did this mean? Well, ATI was advertising their cards as Direct3D and OpenGL accelerators, not as ATI CIF accelerators. This seems kind of confusing because the cards themselves were supposed to take on the Voodoo, and in doing so, well, you would think that ATI would want to use its own proprietary technology. But it didn't. And actually, to make matters worse, early versions of the ATI Rage cards lacked Z buffering when used in Direct3D mode. In fact, ATI basically utterly failed to push ATI CIF to the point that it's pretty much been forgotten to history. So much so that even on retron.de, which under the page 3D Rage Pro AGP 2X for the All-in-Wonder edition, which featured a TV tuner, yeah, there is one sentence and it says, the Rage Pro has ATI CIF support, ATI's own proprietary 3D rendering API. That's it. Nothing more. That is it. Speaking of, let's talk a little about the 3D Rage Pro and the 3D Rage Pro architecture's enhancements. The 3D Rage Pro marked a drastic shift from the 3D Rage in terms of 3D acceleration capability. While the 3D Rage often suffered at higher resolutions and was unable to provide the performance necessary to be considered a competent 3D accelerator, the 3D Rage Pro actually outperformed the 3DFX Voodoo 1. In fact, it was quite a successful architecture and lived on for a number of years. But that being said, the 3D Rage Pro, well, yeah, it was a bit late to the party. Launched in 1997, it wasn't until mid-1998 when the AGP2X version was released. The AGP2X version, in fact, was the card that I used for all of the testing today, but it was also the card that was faster than the 3DFX Voodoo 1. The AGP1X version was still a competent card though, and marked a drastic shift toward performance and away from the dog days of the ATI 3D Rage 1. And this is where ATI started to get it right. They started to realize that the way to gamers was to their hearts, not just to their pockets. Instead of focusing on price performance and aiming for a lower segment of the market, ATI dreamed high and, well, delivered excellent performance. In fact, for an AGP2X card that was early to the game, it was quite fast. And by quite fast, I mean, yeah, take a look at this advertising material. Even faster than proprietary 3D accelerators like the No. 9 Revolution 3D and the 3D Labs Primidia 2, both of which, while, yes, they were slower AGP cards in the more mature days of AGP, were still very fast for early 3D implementations on the AGP bus. Speaking of, ATI even realized that the ATI Rage chips, well, these new Rage chips, should we say, could actually be used for technology like 3D CAD, animation, and not just gaming. They marketed the cards as expert at work and expert at play. And well, the version I have is the expert at play because it has a composite out. That's literally the only difference, composite and S-Video, which are two features that, to connect to TV for gamers, made sense. But as far as the actual difference between the work product and the play product, yeah, the ATI Expert at Work marked a product for the workplace that wasn't any different than the consumer chip. That's how confident ATI was about these chips. And indeed, ATI was right. Performance was great. In fact, these cards were second to the NVIDIA Revo 128. So for the money, they were really, really fast. And in terms of 3DFX's only 2D 3D capable card at the time, the Voodoo Rush, forget it. The Voodoo Rush was an imperfect implementation, and in fact, the ATI 3D Rage Pro Turbo, or 3D Rage Pro AGP2X, whatever you want to call it, that card was faster. It was even faster than, well, pretty much everything but, like I said, the Revo 128, which is pretty impressive when you consider the fact that it costs substantially less. In fact, the card still supported ATI CIF, while also being, well, a competent 3D accelerator in terms of the open source APIs, in terms of, well, Direct3D and OpenGL. But ATI CIF was really cool. It offered a bunch of interesting features when it came to texturing and when it came to just overall performance increases at higher resolutions. One thing that's as of note is that ATI CIF is very driver particular. In fact, I'll include a little bit in the description about how I was able to get it to work, but you gotta use older drivers, and it's just kind of a pain to get going. When you get it going, you can see things like this tech demo, which are expertly rendered, have a beautiful image quality, and quite frankly, for a 3D accelerated image, don't look nearly as blurry as some games played through Glide. And despite all this, the card isn't that revered today. None of the ATI Rage cards are. Why is that? Well, they ended up in the corporate market. And by that I mean they ended up in pre-built PCs meant to be sold for workplace use, not for gaming. Recall that ATI had basically abandoned CIF from its inception, and you kind of see where this makes sense. The card was a great 2D accelerator using the old Mach 64 core, and yeah, it was low power, it was fast, and it was cheap. I mean, the card itself in 1998 was something like $98. It wasn't even that expensive for a very competent accelerator, and is a cheap and pretty performant card. That's why a lot of these 3D Rage cards ended up integrated on motherboards or in other situations where you wouldn't normally see them for gaming use. And yeah, most gamers by that time had moved on to the 3DFX Voodoo 2, or were still rocking a Voodoo 1, or were anticipating the Voodoo Banshee, or had grabbed the upgraded Revo 128ZX, or even were waiting for the Riva TNT. No matter, it's clear that these were cool cards and that they ultimately flopped. No matter, let's play some games with it and see, yeah, what a Rage Pro Turbo could do in ATI CIF games. And now for our ATI CIF showcase. First up, we have Pod, the classic 1997 racing game running in side-by-side with software and ATI CIF. Next up, another classic, Tomb Raider 1. In ATI CIF, we're able to up the resolution to 800 by 600, and the game runs spectacularly. The only thing that's really important and notable is that while CIF certainly does improve the textures, the blending, the lighting, just the overall look of the game, and it improves the resolution and it improves the performance, you may have already noticed, but yeah, CIF makes games look very dark and dull. And that's just something amongst the API and playing games in CIF that just happens. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it seems like most CIF games have issues when it comes to lighting. It's very reminiscent of the dullness that you get from 3D acceleration in a game like Quake via GL Quake. It's not bad per se, but It's there, and it's noticeable, and if you're a fan of chunkier pixels and more vibrant colors, then software rendering is always going to be superior. That's just a fact. Anyway, here's some undisturbed gameplay. And instead of just side-by-sides, let's play some games in CIF, including those designed for it, with Turok being the first. Now, one funny thing about Turok is the first time I fired it up, I was using the drivers that are built into Windows 98, the ATI 3D Rage Pro drivers. Those drivers are decent, but yeah, you can already see an issue at the menu, right? No words. And we launch into the game and holy god, what is this? That's what happens when CIF is busted. Let's try that again with older drivers that are perhaps a little better. Pretty big difference, right? Well, one of the things that CIF does for Turok is it has that sort of like fog enhancement. The game looks great and it runs well, but I wouldn't say it runs perfectly. Bear in mind though that Turok has a really weird FPS cap of something like 27, so this is about as fluid as it gets. Here's another game that is perhaps a little more reminiscent of PlayStation era games because, well, this was a PS1 game. This is Croc, Legend of the Gobbos, and it is awesome. It's an early platformer and it's kind of cutesy where you control a little crocodile and run around saving your friends and beating up bad guys and collecting crystals, and it's a blast. It's a throwback to a more nostalgic time in gaming. That being said, in CIF mode the game looks great and it runs extremely well. Take a look for yourself. Oh, and one quick note. This game, even in software mode on a 2.8 GHz Pentium 4, lags a little bit. In ATI CIF, well, as you see for yourself, it looks awesome. And finally, this is the ATI 3D Rage version of Mechwarrior 2. This game was made specifically for the 3D Rage cards, and it adds a lot to the game. It adds textures to the ground, it adds textures to the sky, it runs quite well, and it looks great. And yeah, that's what CIF did. Well, it looked pretty solid, as you can see. So, overall then, was CIF a failure? There were games for it, and it really did work well when it worked. Yes, it had the whole 3D acceleration makes things duller, but it wasn't a bad image, and it didn't really harm anything in the long run. The games ran, and they ran much better than they did in software. So, why did CIF fail? Well, ATI's marketing wasn't great, and considering only a handful of games supported it, yeah, it was doomed to fail. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video, and thank you all for all the support throughout GPU June. This has been an awesome event, and I highly recommend you guys check out all the other creators' videos, and there's a link in the description that'll take you there. But anyway, once again, thank you all for watching, and this has been an absolute pleasure, and I really hope you enjoyed. And yeah, if you want to see more content, tune back in next week for another GPU June special, and yeah, please feel free to subscribe, and I'd appreciate it if you have any comments or thoughts. And hey, thanks again for watching. This has been RetroTechBytes.